I was the only one without a present under the Christmas tree in Sophie's perfectly arranged living room. But I didn't cry. I simply reached into my handbag, and everything changed. My name is Margaret Whitmore, though most people in the village call me Maggie. I'm 72 years old, and I live alone in a small stone cottage on the edge of Bath in Somerset, the kind of place where the morning mist lingers on the fields until nearly midday, and the postman still tips his cap when he walks up the garden path. Some people might find the quiet oppressive. I've come to treasure it. My mornings start with the slow gurgle of the kettle, the earthy scent of freshly ground coffee, and a seat at the kitchen table where the winter light falls in a soft rectangle across the worn oak surface. I watch the blackbirds dart across the garden wall, steam curling from my mug. I do the crossword from the Times in the afternoons, watch the 6 o'clock news on BBC One, and I'm usually in bed with a book by 9:30. There's comfort in the rhythm, especially since my Henry died. Henry was my husband for 41 years. He had hands marked by decades of honest work, grease under the nails from his little garage on the high street, and a laugh that warmed every corner of a room. He could fix anything, not just cars. He knew how to fix moods, too. He was the sort of man who listened when you spoke, who made you feel your words mattered. Losing him knocked the air right out of my lungs. For months afterwards, I moved through life like a ghost in my own home. But grief has a strange way of reshaping you. Inch by inch, I found my footing again. Not joy, not yet. But I was upright, steady enough to face each day. If there was one thing I hadn't steadied, it was the distance between myself and my only child, Edward. Ed and I had always been close when he was younger. He'd ring me every Sunday from university, even if it was just to complain about the laundry machines eating his socks. But that closeness frayed after he met Sophie. At first, I thought it was just the busyness of marriage, work, and children. But after Henry's funeral, something in Sophie cooled towards me. And Ed, well, Ed went along with it. The visits stopped. The calls grew shorter, more perfunctory. Then they stopped altogether. In the last year alone, I'd heard from Ed only twice, both times via text. One, "Happy birthday, Mum," with a confetti emoji, and a photo of the children dressed as wizards for Halloween. That was it. So when my telephone rang on a drizzly Tuesday morning in early December and Sophie's name flashed across the screen, I honestly thought it was a mistake. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times. I nearly let it go to voicemail. Then, on some instinct I still can't name, I picked up. "Hello? Hi, Maggie. It's Sophie," she said, her tone unnaturally bright, like polished silverware catching the light. "I know," I replied. She gave a light laugh, as if I'd made a small joke. "I realize this is a bit out of the blue, but Ed and I were talking and, well, we'd like to invite you to spend Christmas with us this year, here, in London. The children would love to see you." I stared out of the window. The last of the leaves had fallen from the old beech tree in my front garden, leaving its branches black and bare against a gray sky. I hadn't been invited to anything in their lives for 4 years. Not birthdays, not school plays, not even Lucy's 6th form graduation. "Well," I said slowly, "that is unexpected." I know," Sophie rushed on. "But the children have been asking about you." And Ed thought, well, it's time. Time for what? I wondered. But I didn't ask. Instead, I sat there with the phone warm against my ear, my heart doing something strange in my chest. "It's been too long," Sophie added, the sound of her voice muffled slightly, as though she'd turned away from the receiver for a moment. In the background, I heard a dog bark, probably their golden retriever, Rupert, the one I'd never met. "I'll think about it," I said at last. "Of course, we'd really love to see you." We ended the call, and I sat for a long while staring at the handset. Sophie had always been polite to me, painfully polite. The sort of politeness that acted as a wall, not a bridge. Behind the niceties, there was a chill I could never quite thaw. And Ed. Ed never challenged it. He just faded further into her world. The last time I'd seen them all together was Christmas Eve, 4 years ago. I'd baked a treacle tart and 2 mince pies, wrapped gifts for everyone. I remember Sophie leaning in to whisper something to Ed while I was speaking, as if my words didn't matter. That night, they handed out presents one by one and skipped me entirely. No one noticed. Not Ed. Not the children. I left quietly the next morning and never called again. It hurt, yes, but I was tired of pressing myself against a door that was clearly closed. And now, suddenly, I was being welcomed back. I rose from my chair and went to make another cup of tea. The kettle clicked, the steam rose, and that old ache began to press against my ribs. The one that whispered, "Why wasn't I enough?" But another voice, steadier and stronger, rose in reply. "They don't know what I've been doing these last few years." I took a deep breath, went back to the phone, and sent Sophie a brief message. "I'll come." Then I walked to my bedroom, knelt beside the cedar wood chest at the foot of my bed, and lifted the lid. Beneath a neatly folded wool shawl lay a thick brown envelope, sealed and stamped. The title on the front read, "Q4 Performance Report, Second Wind Tales Limited." They didn't know who I had become, but they were about to find out. I wish I could say that the Christmas 4 years ago had been an anomaly, a one-off misunderstanding, but deep down, I knew it was the moment everything truly changed. I can still see it, the glow of the fairy lights on Ed and Sophie's tree, the way the baubles were all silver and gold, not a single homemade paper snowflake from the children in sight. I'd traveled down to London with a boot full of things I'd made and chosen with care. A treacle tart, 2 mince pies, a bottle of Henry's favorite port for Ed, and a stack of wrapped presents. Not expensive things, but each one thought through. A scarf Lucy might like, a model kit for Oliver, a storybook for Grace. I'd dressed as nicely as I could. A green wool dress, my best brooch, the pearl earrings Henry gave me for our 25th anniversary. I wanted to look like I belonged there. When the evening came, they gathered in the sitting room, mugs of mulled wine in hand. The children sat cross-legged on the floor, eyes wide as the first present was passed from the base of the tree. Sophie read each gift tag aloud like a compere at a village fete. To Lucy, from Mum and Dad. To Oliver, from Aunt Fiona. To Grace, from Nana Whitmore. I smiled when my name was called for Grace's present. But as the pile dwindled, I noticed something. No one had called my name. The children tore paper, the adults laughed, and still, nothing. I kept waiting for Sophie to reach under the branches and pull out some small last gift for me. She didn't. When the final tag was read, I sat with my hands folded in my lap, a polite smile fixed on my face. The silence around my missing gift wasn't intentional cruelty, not exactly, but it was worse in a way. It was oblivion. I simply wasn't on their list, not in their thoughts, not in their plans. No one noticed. Not Ed. Not even Lucy. I went to bed in the guest room with a weight in my chest I couldn't quite name. The next morning I left before breakfast, slipping away into the grey London dawn, my little suitcase bumping along the pavement. I didn't leave a note, and I never called them again. After that, there were fewer and fewer reasons to see them. Fewer invitations, too. When I offered to come and help with the children during the summer holidays, Sophie said they had plenty of cover, thank you. When I suggested we might take the children to Brighton for a weekend, she said Oliver had football practice and Grace had ballet. Too much going on, really. I tried not to mind. Tried to tell myself they were busy, that London life was hectic. But the truth was harder. I was being quietly removed. Sophie was never rude. not in the obvious, scene-making way. Her skill was subtler, more refined. A tiny correction in my story mid-sentence, as though she needed to tidy up my details. A little laugh when I gave the wrong term for some app or gadget, followed by, "Oh, Maggie, you mean Instagram, not Insta thing." It was always softened with a smile, but the point was made. I was out of step, out of place. I remember one Sunday lunch, not long after Henry died. Sophie was showing off a new coffee machine to the family. It gleamed on the counter like something from a science fiction film. Chrome body, blue-lit display, more buttons than a cockpit. She made everyone a cup, complete with frothy art on top. Then she turned to me and said, "You probably just want tea, right?" It was a question, but it wasn't. I smiled and said, "Yes, tea will be lovely." And we both knew what had just been said without words. Those little exclusions piled up. And Ed, oh Ed, he never stepped in. I could tell myself he was trying to keep the peace, to smooth over the sharp edges. But his silence was its own kind of choice. Sometimes when I asked him a question, he'd glance at Sophie before answering, as if waiting for her approval. That glance hurt more than anything he might have said outright. The only one who kept a genuine connection with me was Lucy. Even as a teenager, she'd text me photos of her sketches or ask what book I was reading. She never wrote much, just enough to remind me I wasn't entirely invisible. Once, she sent me a photo of a bracelet she'd made in art class. "For Granny," the message read. "I keep it in my nightstand drawer, the one with the lavender sachet." Then came my 70th birthday. I hadn't expected a grand celebration, no banners, no cake with 70 candles. But I did think I might get a card, perhaps a call, maybe a FaceTime from the grandchildren. I waited all morning, making excuses for them in my head. They must be busy. Perhaps they were planning a surprise. By mid-afternoon, I began to check my phone every few minutes. The post arrived. Nothing for me but a utility bill. By 6 o'clock, the truth settled in. They had forgotten. Or worse, they remembered, and didn't think it mattered. I boiled the kettle, poured myself a cup of Earl Grey, and sat in my chair by the window as the evening pressed against the glass. That was when the tears came. Not for the lack of presents or cake, but for the realization that I was no longer a part of their lives. Not truly. I was a background extra in their family story. Someone they might mention occasionally in passing, but not someone whose presence shaped the scene. Something in me shifted that night. I stopped phoning. Stopped trying to wedge myself into their crowded schedules. The silence that followed was surprisingly peaceful. At first, I didn't know what to do with that quiet. I filled it with small things. Walks through the village, trips to the library, afternoons rearranging the bookshelf. But soon, the quiet began to feel like space. Space to breathe, space to think, space to ask myself what I wanted. I wasn't ready to sit and wait for life to finish me off. I still had my mind, my health, a little money in savings. I'd always loved writing, kept journals for years, written little essays that never saw the light of day. I'd read countless magazines and interviews with women in their 60s and 70s doing marvelous things, starting businesses, painting, traveling. I'd think, if they can, why not me? One evening, quite on a whim, I found myself typing into Google, "How to start a blog at 70." It was as if I'd opened a door I didn't know existed. But that's the story I'll get to in time. For now, what mattered was this. By the time Sophie rang me that damp December morning, inviting me back into their home, I was no longer the Maggie they'd quietly pushed aside. I was someone else entirely. And though they didn't yet know it, I had no intention of slipping meekly back into my old place at their table. The night of my 70th birthday stayed with me like a cold draft you can't quite shut out. Not because I wanted fuss and fanfare, but because that silence, from my own family, felt like confirmation of something I'd been trying not to admit for years. They had moved on without me. The days that followed were grey and short. Winter in Somerset has a way of sitting heavy on the shoulders. The lane outside my cottage was slick with frost in the mornings, the air sharp enough to make my eyes water. Inside, the radiator clicked and groaned, the windows fogged at the edges, and the quiet stretched itself long across the hours. I'd never been one for wallowing, but there's a difference between keeping busy and feeling alive. I realized I'd been doing a lot of the former, and almost none of the latter. One afternoon, while tidying the top shelf of the bookcase, I came across an old leather-bound notebook. Henry had given it to me one Christmas, the last one before he died, saying, "For your stories, Maggie. One day, you might even share them." I remember laughing, brushing it off. But now, holding it in my hands, I felt a stirring I hadn't in a long time. That night, after a dinner of vegetable soup and crusty bread, I sat at my desk by the window and opened my laptop. It was old and slow, with a faint rattle in the keys, but it would do. I typed into the search bar, "How to start a blog." I expected something simple, perhaps a neat little list. Instead, I found myself staring at a maze of unfamiliar words: SEO, hosting, domain registration, landing pages. I didn't understand half of it. It was like someone had dropped me in a foreign city with no map. But here's the thing. I've always been stubborn. If I don't know the way, I'll find it. I made a cup of tea, came back, and opened a fresh page in the notebook. At the top, I wrote in block capitals, "Start here." Underneath, I began jotting down every new term, every bit of advice, even if I didn't yet know what it meant. That first night, I learned about setting up a simple website, free blogging platforms, and the basics of writing online. The next morning, I decided 1 hour a day would be learning time. By the end of the week, that hour had become 2. One evening, while browsing through endless articles, I stumbled upon a course for older adults starting small businesses. It was called Silver Skills, Digital Basics for Beginners over 60. The course cost just $20, and the description promised step-by-step guidance you could pause and replay. That part sold me. I clicked Enroll before I could talk myself out of it. For the next fortnight, my little desk became a classroom. I watched each video 3 times over, pausing to take notes, rewinding when I missed something, how to write blog posts that people actually want to read, how to make them find you on Google, how to set up an email list and send a newsletter. At first, I thought I'd just write a few pieces for fun. Personal essays, perhaps a recipe or two, stories from my life in the village. But the more I learned, the more I realized I wanted this to be something. Not a hobby to pass the time, but a project with shape and purpose. I started thinking about a name, something that reflected exactly where I was in life. Not at the start, not at the end, but somewhere in between. Finding new breath after a long climb. One frosty afternoon, while sweeping crumbs from the kitchen counter, it came to me. Second Wind Tales. It fit like it had been waiting for me to find it. I signed up for a simple website builder, bought the domain name, and posted my first article, "What No One Tells You About Turning 70. It got 12 views the first day, 20 the next. On the third day, a woman named Nora left a comment. "This is exactly how I feel. Thank you for putting it into words." I stared at that line for ages. Someone out there had read my words and felt less alone. That was worth more than any gift I could imagine. Encouraged, I kept writing. I shared small things, reflections on grief, tips for cooking for one, budget-friendly home comforts, ways to make a day feel worthwhile when you live alone. I didn't pretend to have all the answers. I simply told the truth. Slowly, the audience grew. 10 readers became 50. 50 became 200. I began receiving emails from women in Cornwall, Edinburgh, even as far as Canada. They shared their own stories of widowhood, retirement, starting over. They weren't looking for miracles. They wanted connection, the knowledge that someone else understood. Somewhere along the way, I discovered Etsy. I'd been reading about printables, downloadable journals, planners, recipe cards you could design and sell online. I wasn't an artist, but I'd always had a good eye for layout and detail. I signed up for an account and started experimenting on Canva, the design tool I'd heard about in the course. My first products were simple: a gratitude journal with prompts, a recipe binder, a memory book for recording family history. I priced them low, $3 or $4, enough to make a little, but not so much that it felt out of reach for anyone. I remember the first sale vividly. The email pinged into my inbox one rainy afternoon. "You've made a sale." It was only $3.50, but I felt like I'd won the lottery. By the end of that first month, I'd made enough to cover my grocery bill. By the third month, I was earning more in a week than I'd ever thought possible, from something that started as a late-night Google search. I kept my progress to myself, not out of shame, but out of self-preservation. I could picture exactly how it would go if I told Ed and Sophie. They'd smile politely, ask a few cursory questions, and then, inevitably, pick it apart. Or worse, diminish it into a quaint, mum's little hobby. So I built quietly, steadily, like a gardener tending a plot behind high walls. By the time a year had passed, Second Wind Tales had over 10,000 readers. My Etsy shop was selling dozens of items a week, and I'd published my first short ebook on Amazon Kindle, After the Funeral, Finding Yourself Again. I set myself goals, not grand, intimidating ones, just enough to keep moving forward. Learn one new skill each month. Try a new product idea every fortnight. Send a weekly email to my readers, even if it was just a short encouragement. It became my routine, my rhythm, my purpose. That's the thing no one tells you about getting older. The world shrinks if you let it. People assume you've had your big moments, your exciting chapters, and now you're just meant to watch the years roll by from the sidelines. But I wasn't done, not by a long shot. And in that long, cold winter after my 70th birthday, I struck the match that would light everything that came next. By the time my 71st birthday came around, I was a different woman from the one who had sat staring at a silent phone the year before. Second Wind Tales wasn't just a blog anymore. It was an ecosystem, a living, breathing community. And I had built it entirely from my small stone kitchen, usually with a pot of tea steaming beside me and Rupert, the neighbor's tabby, dozing on the windowsill. It started slowly, but by the end of that first year, the numbers had taken on a life of their own. 20,000 readers a month, then 30, then 85. The Etsy shop was selling more than 100 products a week: printable journals, memory books, recipe planners, even a series of quiet time reflection cards that seemed to strike a chord with widows and empty nesters. One of my ebooks, Navigating Widowhood, A Gentle Guide, had been shared in an online grief group. Within weeks, I was getting orders from as far as New Zealand and Singapore. My inbox became a kind of modern-day post bag filled with thank you notes, small confidences, and occasionally a handwritten letter sent to my P.O. box. The money was more than I had imagined possible. That first quarter where my profit tipped over $20,000, I stared at the screen for so long the monitor went to sleep. By the next quarter, it was closer to $30,000. In one December alone, thanks to a feature in Silver Years magazine, I sold over 9,000 printable journals. It was absurd, wonderful, surreal. I didn't tell Ed or Sophie a word. Some days I would picture the conversation. Me: "I've built something, actually." Sophie: "Oh, that's nice, Maggie. Is it one of those little Facebook pages? Ed, half listening. Well done, Mum. No, I wasn't going to give them the chance to minimize it. It wasn't just the fear of their dismissiveness. It was also the knowledge that this work, these women, this purpose, belonged to me in a way nothing else had in years. I didn't want it picked apart or repackaged as a family venture I had no real control over. So I kept it under wraps, like a precious loaf rising under a tea towel on the counter, warm, alive, and mine. With the income, I allowed myself a few quiet luxuries. I upgraded my ancient laptop to a sleek new model with a backlit keyboard, so I could work at night without straining my eyes. I bought a decent printer for fulfilling orders. I replaced my mobile with one that let me record voice notes on the go, perfect for when an idea struck while I was at the market or walking along the River Avon. I also began reinvesting in the business, hiring a freelance designer from Yorkshire to give the blog a proper facelift, paying for software that made my workflow smoother, commissioning illustrations for a new line of guided journals. My days found a new rhythm. Mornings were for writing, a blog post, a newsletter, or drafting product descriptions. Afternoons were for design and correspondence. Evenings were for learning, new courses, marketing strategies, anything to sharpen the edges of my skills. And still, not a whisper of it to my family. By late autumn, I'd quietly purchased something I'd been dreaming about for years. A 2-bedroom flat in the center of Bath, just a short walk from the covered market and the Abbey. The light in the front room was glorious, the kind of pale, steady light that makes you want to write for hours. The second bedroom would be my studio, lined with bookshelves and plants. When the sale completed, the estate agent slid the silver key into my palm. I closed my fingers around it and felt solid, rooted, like I'd planted a flag in my own name. I kept the key on a small ring in my handbag, alongside a tiny brass charm Henry had once given me. Most people wouldn't notice it, but I knew it was there, and the knowledge made me smile every time I reached for my purse. It was around then, just as the Christmas lights were going up in the village, that Sophie called. The invitation to spend Christmas in London caught me off guard, but not unprepared. In the years since I'd last been there, I'd learned how to walk into a room with my shoulders back, my voice steady, my own worth quietly burning beneath the surface. I decided to go, not because I expected reconciliation, but because I wanted to, for myself. I booked the train, planned my wardrobe, and selected gifts for each of them. I wasn't going to arrive empty-handed. The presents weren't expensive, that was never the point, but they were thoughtful. For Lucy, a lavender-scented candle in a glass jar with a sketch of Bath on the label. For Oliver, a leather-bound notebook for his school projects. For Grace, a box of watercolor paints in a tin. For Ed, a proper leather satchel to replace the worn briefcase he'd had since university. For Sophie, a kitchen linen set in sage green, the exact color she'd posted about on Instagram last spring. I wrapped each one carefully in brown paper, tied with red and white string, and labeled them in neat handwriting. The basket sat by the door for a week before I left, a small reminder that I was going on my terms. The night before my journey, I packed a single suitcase, black wool trousers, a soft gray jumper, my winter coat, and the pearl earrings from Henry. I polished my boots, tucked the presents into one corner of the case, and slid the envelope marked Q4 Performance Report, Second Win Tails Linity, into the inner pocket of my handbag. Next to it, I placed the silver key to my new flat. As I zipped the bag, I caught my reflection in the hall mirror. There was a faint smile on my face. Not smugness, not anticipation of some grand reveal, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing that whatever awaited me in that London townhouse, my worth wasn't on trial. The next morning, I set off before dawn. The train from Bath to London rolled past frost-tipped fields, and rows of terraced houses, with smoke curling from chimneys. I watched the countryside blur into suburbs, then into the glass and steel of the city. When I stepped off at Paddington, the air felt different, sharper, busier, scented faintly with roasted chestnuts from a vendor near the entrance. A taxi took me through streets strung with fairy lights, shop windows decked out in winter displays, people rushing past with armfuls of parcels. By the time we turned onto Ed and Sophie Street, lined with white Georgian townhouses and glossy black doors, I was ready. Ready to walk into whatever welcome, or lack thereof, they had prepared. I paid the driver, lifted my suitcase, and carried my basket of gifts up the steps. For a moment, I rested my hand on the silver key in my bag, just to feel its shape. Then I pressed the doorbell. Sophie answered. Her smile was warm enough to pass inspection, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Maggie," she said, drawing out my name. "You made it." She leaned in for a quick hug, the kind where you barely touch, and ushered me inside. The house was immaculate, scented faintly of pine and cinnamon. The Christmas tree stood in the corner, tall and symmetrical, dressed in silver and white, like something out of a department store catalog. Not a single handmade ornament in sight. Ed appeared from the kitchen, phone still in hand. "Hi, Mum," he said, giving me a brief one-armed hug. "Glad you could make it." The children were on the sofa, eyes locked to tablets. I waved. "Hello, sweethearts." "Hi, Granny," they murmured without looking up. Sophie led me upstairs to the guest room. It was smaller than I remembered, the bedding a faded floral from their first flat. A thin layer of dust coated the dresser. The overhead light flickered when I switched it on. "If you need anything, just shout," Sophie said, already halfway out the door. "Thank you," I replied. After she left, I unpacked in silence, lining my shoes neatly under the bed. The basket of gifts went into the corner, my pajamas on the pillow. My handbag, with its envelope and silver key, stayed by my side. I sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, looking at my suitcase as if it might offer advice. Then I smoothed the coverlet and stood. This was just the beginning. They had no idea. And that, I thought, was exactly how I wanted it. By the time I came down to the dining room that evening, the table looked like something out of a glossy food magazine. Sophie had set it with white linen, silver-edged china, and crystal glasses that caught the light from the chandelier overhead. A garland of eucalyptus and berries ran down the center, dotted with tea lights in little glass holders. Place cards marked each seat. My name was down at the far end, next to the serving trolley. Sophie bustled about in a silk blouse and a pair of tailored trousers that probably cost more than my entire outfit. She carried in a roast duck glistening under a cherry glaze, flanked by bowls of quinoa salad studded with pomegranate seeds and roasted parsnips with rosemary. The scent was rich and sweet, but there was a faint air of formality about it all, as if we were dining in a showroom rather than a family home. Ed poured wine into the glasses, his phone never leaving the sideboard. The children appeared briefly, sliding into their chairs with the distracted air of people who'd rather be somewhere else, which in their case probably meant back in front of their screens. "Right," Sophie said brightly, taking her seat at the head of the table. "Shall we?" The conversation flowed easily enough, but only in one direction. Sophie launched into a detailed account of her company's latest holiday campaign, tossing around terms like conversion rates and brand engagement, as if we were all fellow marketers. Ed chimed in with updates about an investment app he'd been dabbling in. Lucy asked a question about Bitcoin, which led to a spirited back and forth between father and daughter. I sat quietly, sipping my tea, letting the talk wash over me. No one asked how I'd been. No one asked what I was working on. I wasn't surprised. I'd learned years ago that this table made space for loud voices, not necessarily for all voices. About halfway through the main course, Sophie turned to me with the kind of smile that isn't really about warmth. It's about timing. "So, Maggie," she said, "what are you up to these days? Still into those little retirement hobbies?" The words were light enough, but I caught the glimmer in her eye, the faint amusement at my expense. Around the table, a few smiles appeared. Even Ed gave a quick grin. I kept my face calm, my voice level. "Something like that," I said, taking another sip of tea. Sophie nodded, already turning back to Ed to ask about his next business trip. By the time the plates were cleared and the sticky toffee pudding appeared, the conversation had drifted back to their holiday plans. Ski trips, theater tickets, a spa weekend Sophie had booked for herself. I smiled in the right places, but my mind was elsewhere. I had not come here to start an argument, nor to beg for a place at this table, but the pattern was the same as it had always been. They assumed my life was small, idle, unremarkable, and perhaps, once upon a time, it had been, but not anymore. The next morning, the house was already buzzing by 8 o'clock. Sophie was in the kitchen, flitting about in a matching pajama set, arranging cinnamon rolls on a tray. Ed was pouring orange juice, phone in hand. The smell of coffee drifted through the air. The children darted from room to room, waiting for the moment they'd be allowed to open the presents. By the time we gathered in the sitting room, the Christmas tree was lit, the fireplace crackling, and the floor beneath the branches was piled high with parcels. Every gift was wrapped in coordinated paper, silver with white ribbon, and tagged in neat calligraphy. Sophie clapped her hands together. "Right, everyone, let's get started." The children dove in first, paper flying, ribbons tossed aside. Lucy unwrapped a brand new MacBook and flung her arms around Ed's neck. Oliver got a gaming headset and a smartwatch. Grace squealed over a dollhouse taller than she was. Ed handed Sophie a long, slender box containing a designer handbag she clearly knew was coming. Her smile was more confirmation than surprise. In return, she gave him a sleek golf bag, still smelling faintly of leather. They paused for photos in front of the tree, all smiles and tidy poses. Sophie's hand resting lightly on Ed's shoulder as she said, "You did well this year." I sat on the edge of the sofa, my cup of tea balanced in my hand, smiling when someone glanced my way. I didn't need to count the parcels to know there were none for me. The space in front of my seat was bare. I simply watched, the warmth of the mug steady in my palms. Then Sophie, mid-photo, glanced around with a look of exaggerated realization. "Oh, did we forget one?" she said, scanning the pile. Ed cleared his throat and looked down at his coffee. Lucy glanced at me, opened her mouth as if to speak, then shut it again. "Oh dear," Sophie said with a small laugh. "I must have forgotten you in all the chaos, Maggie. So much going on this week. You know how it is." I nodded, the same calm nod I'd given in other years when they'd passed me over. "Of course," I said lightly. Oliver, fiddling with his new controller, gave a little chuckle. "Granny's used to it." The room laughed softly, not cruelly, not outright, but the sound cut all the same. I looked at the piles of paper and ribbon, at their happy, busy faces. Then I looked at the empty space before me, and something inside me settled, not in defeat, but in decision. I set my tea down gently on the side table. "Actually," I said, my voice carrying just enough to hush the room, "I got myself something this year." The chatter faded. Sophie tilted her head. "Oh?" I reached into my handbag, slow and deliberate, and pulled out a plain brown envelope. Inside was a neatly printed summary, 4 pages, stapled. No bright colors, no bows. Just the facts. I placed it on the coffee table in front of me. "You know that little blog I started a while back?" I said casually. "Well, it's grown." No one moved. "It's called Second Wind Tales," I went on, "about life after 60. Loss, change, starting again. We have around 85,000 readers now, mostly women, mostly here in the UK, but quite a few abroad." I turned the top page. "I also have an Etsy shop." printable journals, e-books, that sort of thing. I sell about 100 products a week. Ed blinked. Wait, seriously? I nodded. Last quarter, the income was just over £38,000. For a second, the number just hung in the air. Sophie squinted, as if checking she'd heard correctly. Are you saying this is yours? Yes, I said evenly. Built it myself. Learned everything online. Ed reached for the paper, flipping through the pages. You made this much in 3 months? Sometimes more, I replied. Lucy's eyes were wide. Her mouth pressed into a grin she was clearly trying to keep in check. Even Oliver had put his controller down. Sophie crossed her arms. And you never told us. You never asked, I said simply. The room stayed quiet, but this time there was no polite chuckle, no side conversation, just the weight of a truth they hadn't expected to hear. I reached into my bag again and pulled out a smaller envelope. This one contained the silver key. I held it up, the metal catching the light from the tree. What's that? Ed asked. A key to my new flat in Bath, I said. 2 bedrooms. One for me, one for my studio. Good light, near the market. Ed's eyebrows rose. Sophie's lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. I slipped the key back into the envelope, placed it in my lap, and picked up my tea again. They still thought of me as the woman with little retirement hobbies. Not anymore. The room didn't spring back to life immediately after my reveal. It stayed suspended, like a stage just after the curtain has dropped, the audience unsure whether to clap or wait for an encore. Ed still held the printout from my envelope, flipping it back and forth as if the numbers might change if he stared long enough. Sophie, arms folded, tapped one manicured nail against her elbow, her gaze fixed on me with the kind of cool scrutiny usually reserved for a new neighbor who's put the wrong bin out on collection day. Lucy was the first to speak. Granny, that's amazing, she said, her voice low but warm, like properly amazing. Oliver nodded, looking up from his controller. Yeah, that's... wow. Sophie's lips tightened just slightly. Well, she said, I suppose congratulations are in order. It's impressive, considering. Considering what? I asked, keeping my tone light. Oh, you know, she replied with a little laugh. It's not exactly easy to run something like that at your stage of life. I smiled without showing teeth. True, but it's amazing what you can do when you put your mind to it. The conversation shifted quickly, but not in the direction I'd hoped. It wasn't curiosity about the women I'd helped or the articles I'd written. It wasn't questions about how the community worked or what my next project might be. It was numbers, always numbers. Ed leaned forward. So, Mum, £38,000 in a quarter. That's, what, around 150 grand a year? Roughly, I said. And your costs, he asked. Minimal, I replied. I work from home, hire a few freelancers when needed. Sophie's eyes lit up, just faintly, but I caught it. And it's just you? No partners? No shareholders? No one but me. From that point on, I could almost hear the gears turning in their heads. Ed leaned back, looking at Sophie, then back at me. You know, Mum, there's a lot of potential here. If you expanded, did more marketing, maybe brought in some investors, you could really scale this thing. Sophie nodded enthusiastically. Yes, you could have a proper brand, not just the online stuff. Events, maybe retreats for older women, partnerships with lifestyle companies. I've got contacts who could get you into magazines, podcasts. I sipped my tea and listened. They were speaking in the tone people use when they spot an unclaimed parking space in central London. A mix of excitement and ownership, as though they'd already decided it was theirs. And with your audience, Sophie went on, there's so much you could do in terms of product lines. Homeware, clothing. You could really push this. I set my cup down gently. It's doing just fine as it is, I said. Sophie tilted her head as if she hadn't heard me correctly. Of course. But if you want to really grow, I'm not looking to really grow, I said, more firmly this time. I built it to help people. It's comfortable. It gives me purpose. That's enough. Ed frowned slightly. But Mum, this is a real business. You've got to think about the future. I met his eyes. I am thinking about the future. Mine. There was a pause. Not long, but long enough to register. Sophie's smile cooled a degree. Ed glanced back at the printout, then slid it onto the coffee table as though it might burn his fingers. The rest of the morning unfolded in polite fragments. Sophie busied herself in the kitchen. Ed helped Oliver set up his new gaming system, and I sat with Lucy as she showed me the first sketches in her new notebook. But I could feel it, a shift, subtle but certain. My news had startled them, yes, but surprise was already curling into something else. Ambition, calculation. They had just learned there was more to me than they'd thought. But instead of simply respecting that, they were already working out how they might fit themselves into it. That afternoon, Sophie suggested we pop out for a little stroll before the Boxing Day sales. We wandered down the high street, past shop windows heavy with winter displays, and she steered the conversation back to my work. You know, she said, her tone light but her eyes sharp, I do have a lot of experience with brand partnerships. If you wanted to reach a wider audience, I could connect you with the right people. That's kind of you, I said, but I like my audience just the way it is. She smiled in that careful, polished way of hers. Of course, but imagine what you could do if you had more resources. I have enough resources. A faint crease appeared between her brows, but she smoothed it away. Well, just something to think about. That evening, after the children had gone to bed, Ed knocked on my door. Mum, he said, leaning against the frame, I didn't realize you'd been doing all this. I mean, I thought you were just keeping busy. I was, I said. And then it became something bigger. He rubbed the back of his neck. You know, if you ever wanted to, I don't know, bring me on board, I could help with the business side. Investments, growth strategies. I'm fine, Ed. He blinked. Right. I just thought, it's family, isn't it? You wouldn't have to hire strangers. I looked at him for a long moment. I'm glad you're interested, but it's mine. I want to keep it that way. Something flickered in his expression. Disappointment, irritation, but he covered it with a shrug. Sure, just offering. Later, lying in bed, I thought about the subtle shift in the air since my reveal. 4 years of polite distance, and now suddenly I was a conversation worth having, but not because they missed me, not because they wanted to know me, because they'd discovered I had something they hadn't expected. Independence, resources, leverage. I traced the outline of the silver key in my handbag. My flat, my work, my choice. The pillars of the life I'd built quietly, without their help or their approval. I'd come here prepared to show them the truth of who I was now. What I hadn't prepared for was how quickly they might want to reshape that truth into something that suited them. The next morning at breakfast, Sophie floated the idea again. I was thinking, we could have a proper sit-down after the holidays, talk about potential collaborations. I could bring in my contacts, Ed could handle the numbers, and you could focus on the content. The content, I repeated. Yes, you know, the warm, chatty bits you're so good at. I smiled faintly. I'll think about it. But I wouldn't. Not in the way she hoped. As I cleared my plate, Lucy leaned towards me. Granny, don't let them take over. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but the look in her eyes was clear. She'd seen it too. I squeezed her hand under the table. I won't, I said, and I meant it. Boxing Day morning dawned pale and crisp, the frost turning the lawn into a sheet of white velvet. From the upstairs window of the guest room, I could see the quiet street, the rooftops lined with snow that hadn't yet melted. The village was still. Only the occasional bark of a dog or the distant rumble of a delivery van disturbed the calm. Inside the house, though, there was movement. I could hear Sophie's voice drifting up from the kitchen, clipped and efficient, mixed with the sound of cupboards opening and closing. Ed's deeper tone joined in, his words too muffled to catch, but carrying that familiar sorting things out rhythm. It was their way, brisk, purposeful, no time wasted on lingering in the moment. I took my time getting dressed, not because I was avoiding them, but because today, for the first time in years, I didn't feel as if I needed to rush to meet someone else's schedule. I pulled on a soft gray jumper, my favorite wool skirt, and the silver pendant Henry had given me the year Lucy was born. It wasn't flashy, but it was mine. When I came downstairs, the dining table was set for breakfast. Croissants in a basket, a bowl of fresh fruit, a jug of orange juice. Sophie was moving between the table and the kitchen with the practiced grace of someone hosting guests she wanted to impress or control. "Mornin', Maggie," she said, her smile polite but taut. "Sleep well?" "Very well, thank you," I replied, taking my seat. Ed was already halfway through his coffee, scanning something on his phone. "We thought we'd keep breakfast light," he said. "We've got the big family lunch at 2. Sophie poured juice into my glass, then sat opposite me. "Maggie, I was thinking, if you're serious about keeping your little business just yours, maybe there's another way we can be involved." I took a sip of juice. "Involved?" "Yes," she said. "Not in running it, obviously, but perhaps in celebrating it. You know, making it part of the family story. A legacy." There it was again, that word. Legacy. The polite wrapper they put around something they wanted a slice of. After breakfast, the children disappeared into their rooms, and Sophie and Ed went to make calls before the shops get too busy. I was left alone in the sitting room, the Christmas tree lights blinking gently. I reached into my handbag and pulled out the small package I'd brought from home. It was wrapped in brown paper, tied with red string. No shiny ribbon, no gold foil. Just neat, sturdy folds, and a label with my own handwriting. "To Maggie, from Maggie." I'd been carrying it around for a week, waiting for the right moment. And now I realized the right moment wasn't about them at all. It was about me. I untied the string, smoothed the paper, and opened the box. Inside was a slim, leather-bound journal, the color of dark chocolate, with my initials embossed in gold at the corner. I'd ordered it from a small workshop in Yorkshire, a place that still stitched everything by hand. On the first page, in my own handwriting, I'd written, "To remind you of what you've built, to remind you who you did it for, and to remind you that you never needed their permission." The leather was cool under my fingertips. The pages smelled faintly of ink and cedar. I turned it over and over in my hands, feeling the weight of it. Not heavy, but solid, like something meant to last. This was my gift to myself. Not the journal, not really, but the space it represented, the independence I had claimed quietly, piece by piece, until it was mine alone. The family lunch was at Ed's cousin's place, a larger house, noisier, with more people and more chances for polite performance. The dining room was a long table under a chandelier, the air warm with the smell of roast beef and mulled wine. Laughter rose and fell in waves. As the plates were cleared, Sophie tapped her glass. "Everyone," she said brightly, "before we get too far into dessert, I think Maggie has something to share." I blinked, surprised. "Do I?" Sophie's smile was smooth. "Your little project. You told us yesterday. I think the whole family would love to hear." Dozens of eyes turned toward me. Forks hovered midair. I set down my napkin. "It's not little," I said calmly. "It's called Second Wind Tales. It's a community for women finding their footing again later in life. We have over 85,000 readers. I run it myself, along with a shop and a few books. It's a good life." There was a ripple of polite applause. A few murmurs of "well done" and "that's marvelous." Sophie beamed like she'd been the one to suggest it in the first place. After lunch, people drifted into smaller groups. I slipped away to the conservatory, where the winter light poured through the glass. Lucy found me there, her cheeks pink from the warmth and chatter. "That was brilliant," she said, sitting beside me. "You should have seen their faces when you said the numbers." I smiled. "I did." She hesitated, then added, "Dad and Sophie. They're probably going to try to make it about them." "I know," I said. "But here's the thing. They can only take what I give them." Lucy grinned. "You're not giving them anything, are you?" "Not a scrap," I replied. Back at Ed's house that evening, after the children had gone to bed, I took my journal from my bag and placed it on the bedside table. I opened to the first page again, read the words, and felt something inside me settle into place. The truth was, my gift to myself wasn't just the business, the income, or the flat. It was the choice to be the author of my own story, to write it without waiting for approval or applause. The next morning, Sophie caught me in the kitchen. "I've been thinking," she said, stirring her coffee. "Maybe we could do something special together next year. A family venture, perhaps. Even just a limited run of products, with your branding, but, you know, our reach." I smiled faintly. "Thank you, Sophie, but I'm content with what I have." She tilted her head, lips parting to press again, but something in my tone must have reached her. She just nodded. "Right. Well, as long as you're happy." "I am," I said, and this time she didn't argue. That evening, alone in my guest room, I took out the journal and wrote my first entry. December 27th. Today. I remembered that gifts don't always come wrapped in paper. Sometimes they arrive as decisions, small and steady, that lead you to a place where you don't need anyone else's approval to feel whole. This year, I gave myself the gift of freedom. I intend to keep it. I closed the book, slid it back into the box, and tied the string once more. Not because I meant to hide it, but because some treasures are better kept close until you choose to share them. The morning of my departure arrived quietly, wrapped in the pale blue light of late December. Snow had fallen in the night, not heavy, but enough to soften the outlines of the hedgerows and dust the rooftops like icing sugar. I woke before the rest of the house, not from any alarm, but from the stillness that comes when a decision has been made long before the moment arrives. Downstairs, the Christmas tree still glowed faintly in the corner, though half the ornaments were already packed away in boxes. The air smelled faintly of pine and yesterday's coffee. I boiled the kettle, made myself a cup of tea, and sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around the warmth. There was nothing left to say, and that, I realized, was the point. Sophie came in a little while later, still in her silk robe, her hair loosely pinned. "Oh, you're up early," she said, her voice smooth but not quite alert. "I like the quiet," I replied. She glanced at the half-packed decorations, then at me. "Heading off soon?" "In about an hour," I said. "Train at 11. There was a small pause, just long enough for something unspoken to hover between us. She opened the fridge, poured herself some juice, and said, "Well, it's been nice having you." I smiled faintly. "It's been enlightening." Ed appeared next, tugging on a jumper. "Morning, Mum. Need a lift to the station?" "I've booked a taxi," I said. "Should be here at 10:30. He nodded, rubbing his hands together against the chill. "Right. Well, safe travels." I could tell he wanted to say more, perhaps to return to the conversation about my work, perhaps to angle for a role in it, but the timing was wrong now. The moment had passed. Lucy was the only one who seemed reluctant to let me go. She padded into the kitchen in her dressing gown, hair a-tumble, and sat beside me at the table. "Granny," she said softly, "can I visit you in Bath sometime?" "Of course," I said, taking her hand. "Any time you like. We'll walk along the river, go to the market, have tea in that little shop I told you about." Her smile was bright, but her eyes were damp. "I think You're really brave." I shook my head. Not brave, just done waiting. When the taxi arrived, I carried my own bag to the door. It wasn't heavy. I'd traveled light, as I always did. Sophie hovered in the hallway, offering a quick, safe trip, and the kind of hug you give to an acquaintance rather than family. Ed took my bag for the last few steps, setting it gently in the boot. "You know," he said quietly, "if you ever want to talk about that business of yours." I met his gaze, not unkindly. "I think we've said what needs saying." He gave a half smile, half sigh. "Right. Well, take care, Mom." As the taxi pulled away, I looked back at the house. The frost glimmered on the lawn. The wreath still hung on the door, but already the place felt distant. I had lived in its orbit for years, invited, tolerated, but never truly seen. Now, for the first time, I was leaving not just the house, but the role I'd been assigned within it. The roads were slick but clear, the hedgerows lining the lane like silent witnesses. In the distance, the fields rolled toward the horizon, the pale sun just beginning to burn through the mist. I thought of the journal in my bag, the silver key in my coat pocket, the community I'd built, a life that belonged entirely to me. The train station was nearly empty. I bought a coffee, found a seat by the window, and watched the countryside slide past as the train pulled away. Each mile seemed to loosen something in my chest. By the time we reached the outskirts of Bath, the weight of the visit had already begun to fade. I thought of Lucy's face, her quiet understanding, and felt a thread of hope that perhaps she would take something from my example. Not the business itself, but the knowledge that you can choose your own path no matter how others see you. Back in my flat, I unpacked slowly. The afternoon light poured through the tall sash windows, painting the walls gold. I placed the journal on my writing desk, the key on its hook, and made a pot of tea. For the first time in days, there was no background hum of someone else's agenda. No need to measure my words to fit into their narrow frame. Just the quiet, and the knowledge that it was mine. That evening, I wrote a new post for Second Wind Tales, a legacy from silence. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can give is not money or advice, or even love in the way people expect it. Sometimes it's the example of a life lived on your own terms. I spent years thinking I had to prove my worth to people who'd already decided what I was. This Christmas, I realized I don't. My life is not a pitch to be approved, or a role in someone else's story. It's my own. The gift I gave myself was the permission to keep it that way. And perhaps one day, those who never really saw me will understand. But if they don't, it changes nothing. Freedom is quiet, but it lasts. I hit publish and closed the laptop. Outside, the snow had stopped. The night clear and still. The city lights shimmered in the distance. I thought of Ed and Sophie, perhaps sitting in their kitchen, the echo of my independence still faint in the room. They might call it stubbornness. They might call it pride. But I knew better. It was a legacy. One built not on inheritance or property, but on the quiet certainty that I had lived and would continue to live by my own design. And in that silence I smiled.